Most people think they understand the cartel wars. They watched Narcos. They saw the cocaine, the shootouts, the DEA agents, the kingpins in their mansions. They watched Pablo Escobar build an empire and die on a rooftop in Medellin. They watched El Chapo tunnel out of a maximum security prison. They felt like they understood what this world looked like. They understood a television show. The real cartel wars are something the entertainment industry has never fully put on screen. Not because the stories aren't dramatic enough, but because the reality is too large, too brutal, and too ongoing to fit inside a season of television. We are talking about over 400,000 dead in Mexico alone since 2006. We are talking about military helicopters shot down with rocket-propelled grenades, drone units trained on active war zones in Ukraine, a drug so lethal 1 gram can kill 500 people, and a civil war currently burning through a city of nearly 1 million people. Today, we are covering the real cartel wars, and they are worse than anything Narcos ever showed you. Section 1. The death toll Narcos never showed you. Most people's understanding of the cartel wars comes from a Netflix show. Narcos ran for 3 seasons, covered Pablo Escobar's rise and fall in Colombia, and then moved into Mexico. It was well-produced, genuinely gripping television, and it left millions of viewers feeling like they understood what the drug war actually looked like. They didn't. The show has a body count. Shootings, bombings, assassinations, it all felt enormous. And compared to a normal crime drama, it was. But compared to what actually happened, Narcos was the trailer. The real thing was the feature. When President Felipe Calderón sent the Mexican military into Michoacán in December 2006 to take on the cartels, he started something that had no clean ending. By the time his 6-year presidency was over in 2012, the official Mexican government death toll from the drug war had reached at least 60,000 people. That was the official number. Estimates from researchers and journalists put the real figure above 120,000 killed in that same period, not counting another 27,000 people who had simply vanished. Gone. No body, no explanation, no justice. That was 6 years, 1 administration, 1 country. Since 2006, more than 400,000 people have been killed in Mexico's drug war. Over 125,000 are missing. These are not soldiers or cartel members alone. The dead include mayors, journalists, police officers, migrants traveling through on their way to a better life, farmers caught in the wrong territory, and families who had nothing to do with drugs at all. The war did not spare civilians. It consumed them. Narcos gave viewers Pablo Escobar, 1 man, 1 cartel, 1 era. His story ended in December 1993 when Colombian police shot him dead on a rooftop in Medellin. The show treated that moment as a kind of resolution. The monster was gone, the nightmare was over. What the show didn't tell you is that Escobar's death barely made a dent in the larger machine. Colombian cocaine production didn't stop. Mexican cartels, which had been growing throughout the 1980s and 1990s as transportation partners, simply absorbed the trade and ran with it. The center of gravity shifted north, and then it exploded. By 2024, Mexico's national homicide rate sat at 23.3 deaths per 100,000 people. The majority of those deaths were linked to organized crime. In some states, the situation was significantly worse than that national average suggests. The city of Colima, for example, has ranked among the most violent cities on Earth for 8 of the past 10 years. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because 2 cartels want control of a port. The scale of what has happened is genuinely difficult to absorb. The entire run of Narcos covered perhaps 15 to 20 years of drug war history across Colombia and Mexico. The real war has been running for decades longer than that, across an entire continent, and it is still happening right now. The Colombian cartels that Narcos dramatized were dismantled in the 1990s. What replaced them was larger, better armed, more geographically spread, and significantly more violent. What the show also never captured was how this war feels to ordinary people living inside it. In Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa State and the home base of the Sinaloa Cartel, residents have learned to recognize the sound of gunfire well enough to know whether it is coming closer or moving away. Businesses in cartel-controlled territories pay protection money not because they want to, but because the alternative is having their building burned down or their family threatened. In 2024, more than 30 candidates running for political office in Mexico were killed during the election campaign period alone. Running for mayor in the wrong state is not a career risk, it is a life risk. Homicide numbers alone don't capture what a 20-year armed conflict does to a country. The missing matter just as much. Mexico's government has acknowledged that at least 60,000 people have disappeared since the drug war formally began. Civil society groups believe the actual number is higher. Many of the disappeared were taken by cartels, for recruitment, for ransom, or simply to be eliminated. Many of their families never find out what happened. They spend years searching. Some find mass graves, many find nothing at all. The Narcos version of this world had rules. There were kingpins and DEA agents and court cases. The real version has municipalities where no judge will accept a cartel case because accepting it means dying. It has police forces that were entirely disbanded, their members arrested or fired because they were found to be working for the cartels they were supposed to fight. It has a military that the government has deployed repeatedly over 20 years with no permanent solution in sight. Narcos was, by its creator's own admission, roughly half fiction. The emotional beats, the private conversations, the dramatic confrontations, much of it was written for television. The real drug war doesn't need a writer's room. The facts on their own are worse than anything a screenwriter would put on paper. 400,000 dead, 125,000 missing. A war that started before most of the people watching Narcos were born, and that has not ended. The show gave you a beginning, a middle, and an end. The real cartel wars gave Mexico a generation that grew up counting its dead, and is still counting. The death toll is the easiest part of this story to measure. What's harder to measure is what kind of organization could sustain this level of violence for this long. And Los Zetas answered that question in the most disturbing way possible. They weren't drug traffickers who learned to be violent. They were soldiers who learned to traffic drugs. And the difference between those two things changed everything about how this war was fought. Section 2. Los Zetas, the cartel that broke every rule. Before Los Zetas, Mexican cartels operated by a set of unspoken rules. You bribed the officials you needed. You killed rivals when necessary. You kept your violence targeted and your profile low. You made money. That was the business model: corruption, logistics, and calculated force. The Guadalajara cartel ran it that way. The Sinaloa cartel refined it. It wasn't clean, but it was structured. Then 31 men walked away from the Mexican army, and the entire system collapsed. In 1997, a group of soldiers from the Grupos Aeromóviles de Fuerzas Especiales, Mexico's most elite special forces unit, defected. These weren't ordinary military personnel. GAFE soldiers were trained in counterinsurgency, rapid assault, weapons handling, surveillance, and psychological operations. Some had received training from American and Israeli military instructors. They were, by design, the most dangerous soldiers the Mexican army had. and they walked straight into the employ of Osiel Cardenas Guillen, the leader of the Gulf Cartel, who needed enforcers and had money to pay for the best ones available. They called themselves Los Zetas, after the radio call sign Z1, which belonged to their original commander, Lieutenant Arturo Guzman de Cenas. At first, their job was protection and enforcement for the Gulf Cartel. Bodyguards, hitmen, the muscle behind a trafficking organization. That lasted about a decade before the muscle decided it no longer needed the organization it was protecting. The critical thing to understand about Los Zetas is what they brought that no cartel before them had. Genuine military discipline applied to criminal violence. Other cartels used violence as a tool. Los Zetas used it as a language. They didn't just kill rivals. They staged the aftermath. Bodies were displayed publicly. Messages were left. Beheadings, which had not been a feature of Mexican cartel warfare before, became a calling card. The goal wasn't just to eliminate enemies. It was to make everyone, civilians, officials, rival cartel members, witnesses, understand that no one was safe and resistance was pointless. A professor of government at the College of William and Mary who spent years studying Los Zetas put it plainly. The traditional cartels buy off politicians, establish traffic routes for smuggling, and make money. Then the Zetas arrived with no background in narcotics and started chopping people's heads off. He described it as bad for the bottom line of conventional trafficking. And he was right. But it worked for Los Zetas because they weren't primarily trying to maximize profit through calm operations. They were trying to control territory through terror. And terror worked. What they introduced wasn't just more violence. It was a different category of violence, what researchers called shock and awe tactics. Flaying, castration, public displays of victims, bodies dissolved in acid, people burned alive inside oil drums. These weren't just methods of killing. They were performances designed to communicate to entire communities that the Zetas had no limits and no fear of consequences. The technical term researchers use for what Los Zetas pioneered is hyperviolence. In plain language, it means cruelty used as a management strategy. The most disturbing part of the Zetas story isn't what they did, it's what happened after. Rival cartels that had previously competed through bribes, trafficking routes, and targeted assassinations looked at what the Zetas were doing and drew a simple conclusion. If you want to compete with them, you have to match them. You can't bring bribery to a beheading war. So they adapted. The Sinaloa cartel, which Narcos portrays as the dominant, almost business-like trafficking organization, began using tactics it had never used before. Decapitations became, in the words of one researcher, a staple in the lexicon of violence across Mexican cartel warfare. Los Zetas didn't just change their own organization. They reset the baseline for every organization. By 2010, the Zetas had established a presence in hundreds of municipalities across Mexico. They had moved into Guatemala, seizing drug trafficking territory with the same methods they used at home. They were running protection rackets, kidnapping migrants, extorting businesses, and running sex trafficking operations alongside their drug trade. A government expert who tracked their criminal portfolio listed 20 different types of illegal activity that Los Zetas were involved in at their peak, including the possible harvesting of human organs from victims. That same year, 2010, Los Zetas formally broke away from the Gulf Cartel and declared themselves an independent organization. What followed was a full-scale war between two groups that had previously been partners, fought across the state of Tamaulipas and beyond, with civilians caught directly in the middle. The Gulf Cartel, in its narco banners, public messages hung on bridges and overpasses, accused the Zetas of expanding into murder, theft, extortion, and kidnapping outside the agreed scope of cartel operations. The Zetas responded by posting their own banners, pointing out that they had always done those things on the Gulf Cartel's orders. Both of them were right. The Zetas never became Mexico's richest cartel. They were eventually overtaken in revenue and territory by the Sinaloa cartel, and later the CJNG. Their original 31 members were diluted over time as they recruited street criminals who lacked the military training of the founders. Their leadership was hunted down systematically. Their supreme commander, Heriberto Lascano, was killed in a shootout with Mexican Navy forces in October 2012, and his successor, Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales, was arrested in July 2013 with $2 million in cash and 8 assault weapons in his truck. The organization they built fragmented into smaller factions. Today, Los Zetas no longer exist as a unified group, but the damage they did to Mexico's security landscape was permanent. They proved that a cartel could function like a paramilitary force. They demonstrated that extreme public violence could be used to control entire regions. And they forced every other criminal organization in Mexico to decide: adapt to the new standard or be destroyed by it. Most adapted. Narcos showed viewers a world where the worst thing a cartel could do was blow up an airplane or bribe a presidential candidate. Los Zetas were operating in an entirely different dimension, one the show never touched. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Los Zetas did to the standards of cartel violence is disturbing enough in the abstract, but the clearest way to understand what they actually were is to look at a specific place, a specific road, and 2 specific months in 2010 and 2011, when they stopped passenger buses at fake military checkpoints and decided what to do with everyone on board. What happened next in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, is the kind of thing that doesn't make it into prestige television. Not because it isn't dramatic enough, but because it is too real to be entertainment. Section 3. The San Fernando Massacres. 265 civilians killed at fake checkpoints. San Fernando is a small municipality in the northeastern Mexican state of Tamaulipas, about 120 kilometers south of the U.S. border. Mexican Federal Highway 101 runs straight through it. For decades, buses carrying migrants, workers, and ordinary travelers passed through San Fernando on their way north. In 2010 and 2011, Los Zetas turned that stretch of highway into one of the deadliest roads in the Western Hemisphere. Not because of a battle, not because of a military operation, because they decided that the people on those buses were useful to them, as ransoms, as recruits, or as a message, and that none of those people had any right that Los Zetas were required to respect. The first massacre happened in August 2010. A group of migrants, men and women from Central and South America, most of them heading toward the United States, were traveling through Tamaulipas when Los Zetas stopped them. The cartel demanded money. The migrants, many of whom had spent everything they had just to get this far, couldn't pay. Some were offered a choice: join the organization, work for the Zetas, and live. The ones who refused were taken to a ranch in San Fernando. All 72 of them were killed. Their bodies sat in a warehouse on that ranch until an Ecuadorian survivor, a man who had survived by faking his own death, managed to crawl away and reach a military checkpoint. He led the Mexican Navy back to the warehouse. Inside, they found 72 bodies, 58 men, 14 women. All of them migrants who had done nothing except refuse to work for the people who stopped their bus. Amnesty International called it a human rights crisis. The Mexican government called it one of the worst atrocities committed by a drug trafficking organization to that point. The police chief who led the investigation into the massacre was killed by suspected cartel members shortly afterward. 7 months later, in March 2011, it happened again. this time on a larger scale. Between the 24th and 29th of March 2011, Los Zetas members stopped multiple passenger buses on Federal Highway 101 in San Fernando. These weren't migrants this time. These were ordinary bus passengers, people traveling between Mexican cities for ordinary reasons: work, family, routine travel. The Zetas set up what appeared to be a military-style checkpoint and ordered passengers off the buses. They checked phones and text messages, looking for any sign that the people in front of them had connections to their rivals in the Gulf Cartel. Those who were found to have nothing suspicious about them were released. The ones the Zetas decided were suspicious, or the ones they simply wanted, were taken. A senior Zetas commander later confessed that Supreme Leader Heriberto Lascano had ordered the inspection of all buses coming through San Fernando. Those who had nothing to do with the Gulf Cartel were freed, and those who did were killed. One captured killer gave an additional explanation. They were worried that rivals from the states of Durango and Michoacán were using commercial buses to send reinforcements to the Gulf Cartel's territory. What happened to the people they kept is documented in court confessions and investigative reports. Male victims who were physically fit were forced to fight each other to the death. They were given knives, hammers, machetes, and clubs. The survivors of those fights were given a choice between joining the Zetas or being killed. A journalist who interviewed one captured cartel member reported that the Zetas were using what he described as an ancient Roman gladiator format to identify recruits. People who proved they could kill to survive were considered worth keeping. Female victims were raped. Everyone else was murdered and buried. On April 6, 2011, Mexican authorities found 59 bodies in 8 separate clandestine mass graves in San Fernando. They kept digging. By April 12th, the body count had reached 116, spread across 15 mass graves. By April 14th, it was 145. By April 21st, 177. By April 26th, 183. On June 7, 2011, after weeks of excavation, the final count stopped at 193 bodies, exhumed from 47 clandestine mass graves in the municipality of San Fernando, Tamaulipas. One United States citizen was among the dead. By the time authorities wrapped up the investigation, 74 suspected killers had been captured. Among them was Edgar Huerta Montiel, a high-ranking Zetas lieutenant and army deserter who confessed to personally killing 10 of the migrants in the 2010 massacre and to ordering the abduction of the buses in the 2011 killings. He was the same man responsible for both events. He confessed that he had kidnapped other buses in the area beyond the ones authorities already knew about, stealing money from passengers and killing anyone who might have cartel connections, or who he simply decided was a problem. 16 local police officers from San Fernando were arrested as accomplices. They had been working with the Zetas, providing protection and information while the massacres were happening in their jurisdiction. In the 2 San Fernando events combined, Los Zetas stopped buses carrying ordinary people, 265 of them, and killed all of them. Not soldiers, not rival cartel members. Bus passengers, migrants, people traveling between cities on a highway in their own country. Narcos gave viewers a world where cartels were evil but comprehensible. Businessmen who used violence to protect profits. San Fernando was something else entirely. There was no business logic to massacring 72 migrants who couldn't pay a ransom. There was no strategic calculation behind killing 193 bus passengers to screen for potential Gulf Cartel connections. This was violence as total control. The Zetas telling an entire region that no one traveling through their territory had any guarantee of surviving the trip. That message was received. The highway didn't stop being dangerous after the arrests. The region didn't return to normal after the graves were counted. What happened in San Fernando became part of the permanent landscape of fear that cartels use to govern the territories they control. Los Zetas used mass murder to hold territory through fear. But by the time the San Fernando investigations were wrapping up, a new organization had already emerged in the western state of Jalisco that would take everything the Zetas built and militarize it even further, adding rocket-propelled grenades, armored vehicles, drone units, and a willingness to shoot down military helicopters in broad daylight. That organization is the CJNG, and what they built makes Los Zetas look like the beginning of a story that gets significantly worse. Section 4. The CJNG, a cartel that shoots down military helicopters. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was not born into a cartel dynasty. He did not inherit a trafficking empire from a powerful father or uncle. He built one from nothing. And what he built became the most militarized criminal organization in the history of the Western Hemisphere. His story starts in the 1980s when he migrated illegally from Mexico to California, living in San Francisco and Sacramento, where he learned how transnational drug distribution actually worked from the ground up. He was arrested, served 3 years in a U.S. federal prison, and was deported back to Mexico at around age 30. What he did next, nobody predicted. Back in Mexico, Oseguera joined the local police force, working as a municipal officer in the Jalisco towns of Cabo Corrientes and Tomatlan. Then he left law enforcement entirely and joined the Milenio Cartel, a Sinaloa-affiliated trafficking organization operating in Jalisco and Colima. When the Milenio Cartel began to fracture after the death of a key Sinaloa leader in 2010, Oseguera made his move. He founded his own organization. He called it the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The world would come to know it simply as CJNG, and Oseguera by his nickname, El Mencho. Within 2 years of its founding, CJNG had expanded its operational network from coast to coast across Mexico. By 2012, it was already being described as one of the criminal groups with the greatest operating capacity in the country. By 2018, U.S. officials had identified over 100 methamphetamine labs across Mexico linked to the organization. By 2020, the U.S. government considered CJNG its biggest criminal drug threat, and Mexico's former security commissioner called it the most urgent threat to Mexico's national security. From a standing start in 2010, one man had built a paramilitary empire in under a decade. What separated CJNG from everything that came before it was structure. The National Counterterrorism Center described it as having a hierarchical command structure in which regional leaders managed day-to-day operations for El Mencho, combined with a franchise model for expansion outside its core territories in Jalisco, Nayarit, and Colima. Below the leadership sat specialized military units carrying out distinct functions. The Grupo Elite, as the main armed wing for territorial conquest, Fuerzas Especiales Mencho, as a personal protection force for El Mencho himself, and Operadores Droneros, a dedicated drone unit conducting intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeted killings, operational since at least 2017. This was not a gang. It was a paramilitary enterprise with an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 members operating across more than 20 Mexican states. The firepower was real. Mexican officials confirmed the organization possessed military-grade weapons, including machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. That last item is not a detail that should be skimmed over. Rocket-propelled grenades are anti-armor weapons. They are designed to destroy armored vehicles and fortified positions. A drug cartel in western Mexico had them in sufficient quantity that they were being deployed routinely against security forces. In April 2015, CJNG ambushed a convoy of municipal police officers in Jalisco and killed 15 of them. It was one of the single deadliest attacks on security forces in modern Mexican history. 1 month later, in May 2015, Mexican federal authorities launched a large-scale operation in and around Villa Purificación in Jalisco, targeting CJNG infrastructure and attempting to capture El Mencho. During the operation, a military helicopter providing aerial support located an armed CJNG convoy. The cartel's fighters fired a rocket-propelled grenade at the helicopter. It struck. The helicopter went down. 9 soldiers were killed. A drug cartel shot down a military helicopter with an RPG in broad daylight. This was not an ambush that went sideways. This was not an accidental engagement. This was a cartel that had acquired military-grade anti-aircraft weaponry, trained its fighters to use it, and deployed it successfully against the Mexican armed forces. CJNG then launched coordinated retaliatory attacks across Jalisco and neighboring states, roadblocks, vehicle burnings, armed confrontations, specifically to prevent El Mencho's capture during the operation. The operation failed. El Mencho escaped. That same year, 2015, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned CJNG under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, freezing any assets under U.S. jurisdiction and prohibiting Americans from doing business with the organization. It changed very little on the ground. CJNG continued expanding, continued killing, and continued operating in nearly all 50 U.S. states as a drug supplier. In June 2020, CJNG tried to assassinate Omar Garcia Harfuch, Mexico City's Secretary of Public Security, in a brazen daylight attack in one of the capital's most prominent areas. Harfuch survived, but 2 of his bodyguards and a bystander were killed. The attack used a vehicle convoy and high-caliber weapons in the middle of Mexico City. CJNG posted videos of the attack and claimed responsibility publicly. By the time El Mencho was finally killed in February 2026, in a pre-dawn raid by Mexican Army Special Forces on his compound in the mountain municipality of Tapalpa, Jalisco, he had built an organization operating in at least 21 of Mexico's 32 states, active in more than 40 countries worldwide, and present across nearly all 50 U.S. states. His personal fortune was estimated between $500 million and $1 billion. The cartel's total assets were valued as high as $50 billion. The raid itself cost lives. A military helicopter providing aerial support was hit by CJNG gunfire and forced to make an emergency landing. 25 National Guard members were killed in retaliatory attacks across Jalisco in the hours after El Mencho's death. The cartel erected 85 roadblocks on federal highways from Baja California to Oaxaca. Airlines including United, American, Delta, Alaska, and Air Canada canceled flights to Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. The U.S. State Department issued shelter-in-place advisories across multiple Mexican states. That was the aftermath of killing 1 man. Narcos gave viewers a world where the most dangerous thing a cartel could do was bribe a government official or blow up a commercial flight. CJNG shot down military helicopters, tried to kill the security chief of a capital city, built dedicated drone warfare units, and forced international airlines to cancel flights when their leader died. These are not the actions of a criminal organization. They are the actions of a military force that happens to fund itself through drug trafficking. CJNG's ability to wage open warfare against the Mexican state didn't happen in isolation. One of the key weapons that made their expansion possible, and that no television show about cartels has ever properly addressed, is something far cheaper and more accessible than rocket-propelled grenades. It flies above neighborhoods, targets prosecutors' offices, and was refined using tactics borrowed directly from an active war zone in Eastern Europe. The cartel drone program is not a future threat. It is already here. Section 5. Drone Warfare, when Narcos became technologically advanced. In every season of Narcos, the cartels communicate by radio and telephone. They move drugs in boats, planes, and trucks. They kill people with guns. The technology is analog, physical, and traceable, and the DEA and Colombian or Mexican authorities spend the show trying to intercept those communications and track those movements. It is a cat-and-mouse game fought with the tools of the 1980s and 1990s. That world is gone. The cartels operating in Mexico today are not fighting the same technological war that Narcos depicted. They are fighting a different one entirely, one that borrows its most effective new weapon from the battlefields of Ukraine. The use of weaponized drones by Mexican cartels began in documented form around 2020. Since then, it has accelerated every year. The Mexican Ministry of National Defense studied the phenomenon and reached a straightforward conclusion. Cartels use drones because they are difficult to detect, relatively inexpensive, capable of precise navigation, and subject to limited regulation by the government. A commercially available drone that costs a few $100s can carry a small explosive device, fly into a heavily guarded compound, and detonate on impact. The pilot can be half a mile away. There is no physical risk to the attacker. There is no easy way to stop it. In October 2025, CJNG flew an off-the-shelf drone loaded with a primitive explosive device, referred to in Mexico as a potato bomb, directly into the compound of the state prosecutor's office in Tijuana. The compound was heavily protected. It did not matter. Nobody was killed in that specific attack, but that was not the point. The point was the demonstration. CJNG could reach a fortified government facility with a commercially purchased drone, and there was nothing the people inside could do about it. The message landed louder than the explosion. This was not an isolated incident. In the coastal communities of Michoacán, a state where CJNG has been fighting for territorial control for years, residents reported 8 consecutive days of drone attacks on their communities without any intervention from local or state authorities. The communities targeted included Laguna de Calvillo, El Puerto, El Ranchual, and El Salitro de Estopila. Indigenous communities in the municipality of Chiniquila in Michoacán's Sierra Costa region have been subjected to ongoing drone attacks for multiple years running. A joint statement from local human rights organizations and residents described the attacks as generating fear, displacement, and vulnerability among families with no means of protecting themselves and no sign of government response. When CJNG first began asserting control over those coastal Michoacán regions, the attacks relied primarily on firearms. The shift to explosive drones and landmines came as the cartel's operations grew more sophisticated, and its territorial ambitions expanded further. Drones allowed the cartel to isolate communities, cutting off roads, destroying vehicles, preventing movement, without committing large numbers of armed fighters to a location where they might attract military attention. It is a blockade strategy executed from the air. The Mexican Army's drone unit, dedicated to cartel surveillance, identified CJNG as the primary user of weaponized drones among Mexican criminal organizations. U.S. officials at Brookings Institution noted that cartels had also begun operating drones for surveillance and reconnaissance of civil society activists, business community members, and local government officials, tracking whether they were meeting with police, federal officials, or rival criminal groups. The capability to monitor targets from the air, invisibly and continuously, changes the entire dynamic of how cartels control territory. Armed control requires fighters on the ground. Surveillance drones require one person with a laptop and a commercial aircraft. The drone story took a significant turn in August 2025 when Mexican intelligence, working in collaboration with Ukrainian security forces, revealed something that would have sounded like fiction 5 years earlier. Mexican and Colombian mercenaries had been sent to the active war zone in Ukraine, embedded in the International Legion fighting in the Russian invasion, specifically to learn drone warfare tactics. The cartel sent soldiers to a live war to learn FPV drone combat techniques, how to navigate tight spaces, how to strike moving targets, how to coordinate drone attacks with ground operations. By August 2025, CJNG had established a dedicated paramilitary unit of at least 10 members focused exclusively on FPV drone operations, using the techniques brought back from Ukraine. FPV stands for First-Person View. These are racing-style drones flown through a headset that gives the pilot a direct visual feed from the drone's camera, allowing extremely precise navigation at high speed into very specific targets. They are the same type of drone that has been used extensively to destroy armored vehicles and kill soldiers in the Ukraine conflict. CJNG was now deploying them against rivals, security forces, and civilian communities in Mexico. The scale of drone activity along the US-Mexico border has also become a documented security concern. Officials estimated that hundreds of drones are used regularly along the border for reconnaissance and smuggling operations. Cartel drones monitor border patrol movements, track rival operations, and guide drug shipments through gaps in surveillance. The U.S. government has invested significantly in counter-drone technology at the border precisely because the drone threat from cartel operations has become too consistent to ignore. None of this appears in Narcos. Not because the writers made bad choices. The show was set in an era before any of this existed. But the gap between the world Narcos depicted and the world that currently exists is enormous. Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel moved cocaine in suitcases and briefcases, bribed officials by hand, and communicated on radio frequencies that the DEA could intercept with the right equipment. Today's cartels are sending personnel to active war zones to learn military drone tactics, and deploying FPV strike drones against prosecutors' offices and indigenous villages. The technology changed. The cartels changed with it. The television show stayed in 1993. The drones, the weapons, the military structure, all of it costs money and requires protection to operate. And the single most important thing that allows cartels to do all of this without being dismantled is not their firepower. It is the fact that the people who are supposed to stop them are, in many cases, working for them. The corruption that Narcos treated as a colorful backdrop to the main story is, in the real cartel wars, the main story. And it goes significantly higher than a few bribed police officers on a television screen. Section 6. The Sinaloa Civil War. A cartel imploding in real time. The Sinaloa Cartel is the organization that Narcos Mexico spent 3 seasons building toward. It is the group that El Chapo Guzman ran, the one that made him one of the most famous criminals in modern history, the one that the show portrayed as a sophisticated, disciplined operation held together by loyalty, strategy, and the force of one man's personality. That portrayal was not entirely wrong. The Sinaloa Cartel was, for decades, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, present in at least 40 countries, operating across nearly all 50 U.S. states, generating billions of dollars annually. What Narcos could not show you, because it hadn't happened yet, was what occurred when the loyalty that held it together was shattered by one of the most audacious betrayals in the history of organized crime. El Chapo Guzman was arrested for the third and final time in January 2016 and extradited to the United States in 2017. He was convicted of drug trafficking and related charges in 2019 and sentenced to life imprisonment. With the organization's most famous figurehead locked in a U.S. federal prison for the rest of his life, the Sinaloa cartel reorganized around two power centers. The first was Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, who had been El Chapo's co-founder and equal partner since the beginning. El Mayo was 76 years old by 2024, old school in his methods, deeply cautious by nature, and had spent decades avoiding the kind of public profile that had gotten El Chapo captured 3 times. He had never been arrested, not once in his entire career. The second power center was Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Ovidio Guzman Lopez, and Joaquin Guzman Lopez. The 4 brothers had inherited their father's networks and relationships and had built their own reputation as the younger, more aggressive faction of the cartel, with heavy involvement in fentanyl production and distribution. Ovidio was arrested by Mexican authorities in January 2023 and extradited to the United States in September of that year. That left 3 brothers active, and one of them, Joaquin, was quietly making plans that El Mayo knew nothing about. On the morning of July 25, 2024, El Mayo believed he was attending a meeting with Joaquin Guzman Lopez at a local events center in Sinaloa. El Mayo later said he trusted Joaquin because he had known him since he was a young boy. The meeting had been framed as an attempt to resolve the growing tensions between the 2 factions of the cartel. What El Mayo did not know was that the meeting was a trap. According to El Mayo's own account, released through his lawyer, he was subdued at the location and forced onto a private plane. The plane landed in El Paso, Texas, where both El Mayo and Joaquin Guzman Lopez were taken into U.S. custody by federal authorities. The U.S. Department of Justice announced the arrests the same day. Joaquin Guzman Lopez later surrendered voluntarily to U.S. authorities. El Mayo had been kidnapped by his own partner's son and handed to the United States government. The Mexican government stated publicly that it had not participated in El Mayo's capture. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico later confirmed that El Mayo had been brought to the U.S. against his will. Within the Sinaloa cartel, the reaction was immediate. The arrest of El Mayo, achieved through what his own faction believed was a deliberate betrayal by Los Chapitos, destroyed whatever fragile unity had held the 2 factions together. On September 9, 2024, the war began. The first sign was a radio communication, allegedly from a commander in El Mayo's faction, telling his fighters to send Los Chapitos straight to hell. Within hours, 2 heavily armed private armies were fighting in the streets of Culiacan. What followed was not a turf war in any conventional sense. It was a sustained military conflict fought across a major Mexican city. Armed convoys moved through neighborhoods. Bodies appeared before dawn, kidnapped, killed, and dumped on the main highway out of Culiacan with sombreros placed on their heads as deliberate cartel messaging. Men were found with severe bruising, cuts, and broken bones. Shootouts happened in broad daylight. More than 3,000 federal police and soldiers were deployed to Culiacan to try to contain the fighting, arriving in armored trucks, full tactical gear, helmets, and balaclavas, looking, in the words of journalists on the ground, like they were heading into a war zone. Because they were. CNN analyzed public homicide data from Sinaloa and found that since El Mayo's capture, homicides in the state had risen by more than 400%. That number deserves to sit for a moment. Not 40%, not 100%, 400%. In 1 year, homicides in Sinaloa increased by 4 times the previous baseline, and that baseline was already one of the highest in Mexico. The human cost was not abstract. One documented case from the early weeks of the conflict involved a father who had been walking with his 5-year-old daughter when he was stopped and taken by a cartel faction. His daughter was left alone on the street at night until a neighbor found her. That child's father did not come back. By the end of 2024, more than 555 homicides had been recorded in Sinaloa in just the 3 months since the internal conflict formally began in September. The entire previous year, all 12 months of 2023, had seen 531 intentional homicides in the state. 3 months of cartel civil war had already surpassed a full year of ordinary cartel violence. The Sinaloa cartel that Narcos built its mythology around, the disciplined, strategic, loyalty-driven organization, tore itself apart because one man decided to hand his co-founder's father figure to the United States government in exchange for his own surrender deal. That one decision produced a war that is still being fought in a city of nearly 1 million people right now. The Sinaloa Civil War shows what happens when the internal structure of a cartel collapses. But there is a dimension of the real cartel wars that sits entirely outside the cartels themselves, a weapon they use that requires no guns, no drones, and no soldiers. It is corruption. And in Mexico, it does not just reach into police departments and local government. It reaches into the office of the defense secretary, into the judiciary, into the election of mayors and governors, and into the bodies that are supposed to investigate it. Section 7. The fentanyl weapon. Killing Americans without crossing the border. Narcos was a cocaine story. That was the drug at the center of everything. The product that made Pablo Escobar a billionaire, that funded the Medellin and Cali cartels, that gave the DEA its mandate and the Colombian government its crisis. Cocaine is a serious drug. It destroys lives, funds violence, and has done enormous damage to communities across the United States and Latin America. But in terms of raw killing power per gram, cocaine is not even close to what Mexican cartels are producing and shipping north today. The drug that replaced it as the primary product of the cartel economy is not just more profitable. It is chemically capable of killing hundreds of people from a single gram. And it has already killed more Americans than every U.S. war since the Second World War combined. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, meaning it is manufactured in a lab, not grown in a field. It does not require poppy plants or coca leaves or any agricultural input that can be targeted and destroyed. It requires chemical precursors, most of which come from China, and a lab capable of processing them. By 2018, CJNG alone was believed to have over 100 methamphetamine labs throughout Mexico, many of which were also being adapted for fentanyl production. The Sinaloa cartel built its own parallel manufacturing infrastructure. Together, these two organizations became the primary suppliers of fentanyl to the United States, a market they did not create, but absolutely dominated once they entered it. The numbers that came out of this are staggering in a way that takes a moment to absorb properly. In 2023, 107,543 Americans died of drug overdoses. Of those, 74,702, 69%, involved synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. That is, more Americans killed in a single year by a drug supplied by 2 Mexican cartels than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. The entire Vietnam War. And 2023 was not the peak. The peak was the 12-month period ending in mid-2023, during which 112,910 Americans died from drug poisonings. The reason fentanyl kills at this scale comes down to chemistry. A lethal dose is approximately 2 milligrams, an amount roughly the size of a few grains of table salt. 1 gram of fentanyl contains enough lethal doses to kill 500 people. The cartels do not ship fentanyl in pure form. They press it into counterfeit pills designed to look exactly like legitimate prescription medications. Fake Xanax, fake OxyContin, fake Adderall. A person who thinks they are taking a prescription pill they bought from someone they know is, in many cases, taking a pill manufactured in a cartel lab in Sinaloa or Jalisco that may or may not contain a fatal dose of fentanyl. In 2023, DEA laboratory testing found that 7 out of every 10 fentanyl pills seized contained a potentially lethal dose. The distribution model is not what Narcos viewers would recognize. There are no suitcases changing hands in parking lots, no briefcases full of cash, no warehouse meetings between cartel representatives and street-level dealers. Sinaloa cartel members are documented to use social media platforms and encrypted messaging applications to advertise and distribute drugs, as well as to recruit couriers and traffickers. A teenager in Ohio can be reached directly by a cartel-linked dealer through a social media platform. The counterfeit pills arrive by mail. The entire supply chain, from a lab in Mexico to a high school student's bedroom, can operate without a single face-to-face meeting. The scale of what is being shipped across the border is documented in seizure data. In 2024, the DEA seized more than 55 million fentanyl-laced counterfeit pills, down from 80 million seized the previous year. Those 55 million pills, at the potency levels tested in 2024 labs, represented more than 367 million potentially deadly doses seized in a single year. And seizures represent only a fraction of what actually crosses the border. The DEA has been clear that the vast majority of fentanyl enters the United States through legal ports of entry, most commonly in passenger vehicles and commercial cargo. The human dimension of this is not a statistic. It is a 17-year-old in Virginia Beach who took what he thought was a prescription pill and died. It is a 27-year-old in Florida who died from a counterfeit pill traced back through the supply chain to a Sinaloa cartel source. It is families in every U.S. state, not border states, not cities with known drug problems, but everywhere, who are losing people to pills manufactured by 2 organizations that the U.S. government has now designated as foreign terrorist organizations. In February 2025, the Trump administration formally designated the Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG as foreign terrorist organizations. That designation unlocked new legal tools and resources for investigating and prosecuting cartel networks operating inside the United States. It also reflected a shift in how the U.S. government officially categorized what these organizations were doing. Not drug trafficking in the traditional sense, but mass casualty operations conducted against the American civilian population. The trend did show improvement by 2024 and into 2025. The 12-month period ending in October 2024 recorded 84,076 overdose deaths, a 25% decline from the same period a year earlier. DEA laboratory testing by late 2024 showed 5 out of 10 pills containing a lethal dose, down from 7 out of 10 in 2023. These reductions are significant. They represent tens of thousands of American lives that were not lost. But 84,000 deaths in a single year, in a single country, from a single drug supplied by 2 cartels, remains by any measure a mass casualty event happening in slow motion. Narcos ended with Escobar dead and the cocaine trade disrupted. No equivalent ending exists for the fentanyl crisis. The precursor chemicals come from China. The labs are in Mexico. The distribution happens online. The pills arrive by mail. And more than 1 million Americans have died from drug overdoses since the year 2000. The majority from opioids, with fentanyl driving the numbers higher every year until very recently. The show gave viewers a drug war with a finish line. The fentanyl crisis has no finish line in sight. The fentanyl operation requires manufacturing infrastructure, distribution networks, and the ability to move product across an international border at industrial scale, all without being shut down by the governments of two countries trying to stop it. That kind of operational freedom does not come from firepower alone. It comes from having the people who are supposed to stop you on your payroll instead. The corruption that enables all of this is not a subplot in the real cartel wars. It is the foundation everything else is built on. Section 8. State corruption. When the government is the cartel. Narcos had corrupt cops. It had politicians on payrolls. It had a scene here and there where a government official took an envelope of cash and looked the other way. The show treated corruption as texture, background detail that explained why the cartels were so hard to catch. It was presented as a problem within the system, a cancer in an otherwise functional body. What the show never conveyed, because conveying it accurately would have required a completely different kind of story, is that in Mexico, the corruption is not inside the system. In many places and at many levels, the corruption is the system. The cartels did not infiltrate the Mexican state. In significant ways, they helped build it. The foundation of this goes back decades. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, known by its Spanish initials as the PRI, ruled Mexico without interruption for 71 years, from 1929 to 2000. During those 7 decades, drug trafficking organizations cultivated a wide network of corrupt officials within the centralized political structure, gaining distribution rights, market access, and protection in exchange for money and political loyalty. This was not occasional bribery. It was a structured arrangement. Cartels as one pillar of a system that also included the ruling party, the police, the military, and the judiciary. Everyone knew the arrangement existed. Everyone who mattered benefited from it. When the PRI finally lost power in 2000, the new government inherited a security apparatus that had been operating in partnership with drug traffickers for generations. The numbers that measure how deeply this corrupted Mexico's institutions are not subtle. In Transparency International's 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index, Mexico scored 27 out of 100, where 0 represents a country perceived as completely corrupt, and 100 represents a completely clean one. That score placed Mexico 141st out of 182 countries assessed, below the regional average for Latin America, which itself is not a high bar. Trust in public security institutions among Mexican citizens was measured at 18% in 2017. Trust specifically in municipal police, the officers most likely to interact with ordinary citizens, sat at 7%. Not 7% lower than it should be, 7% total. Those numbers exist for reasons that are concrete and documented. Between January 2018 and December 2023, at least 2,638 police officers were killed by cartel-linked criminal organizations across Mexico. That figure covers only confirmed killings of law enforcement. It does not count officers who were threatened into compliance, officers who resigned rather than cooperate or resist, or officers who simply joined the cartel outright. The cartels use a straightforward approach to law enforcement. The choice is described in Mexico as plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the money or take the bullet. In communities where a police officer earns a few $100s a month and a cartel is offering thousands, the math is not difficult for many people to work out. The corruption does not stop at the municipal level. It has been documented at every layer of Mexican government and security infrastructure. In 2020, the United States arrested General Salvador Cienfuegos, a former Mexican Secretary of National Defense, the country's most senior military position, on drug trafficking charges. The indictment alleged that Cienfuegos had protected and assisted a cartel during his time as defense secretary. The U.S. returned him to Mexico 1 month after his arrest, reportedly after an agreement that Mexican authorities would investigate him. He was swiftly released. No charges were pursued. The investigation was closed. El Chapo Guzman, during his trial in the United States, claimed to have paid bribes to 2 former Mexican presidents, Enrique Peña Nieto and Felipe Calderón. Both denied it. The claims were not proven in court. But El Chapo also claimed that his organization had, over the years, paid hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes to Mexican officials at every level of government. Given what is documented about how the Sinaloa cartel operated, maintaining freedom of movement across dozens of states for decades, escaping from maximum security prisons twice, running operations openly in cities where every senior official knew who the cartel leaders were, the existence of protection at the highest levels is not a conspiracy theory. It is the most straightforward explanation for documented facts. The 2024 Mexican general election was the most violent election cycle in 6 years. More than 30 candidates running for political office were killed during the campaign period. These were not national figures. They were candidates for mayor, for local council, for state legislature. People running in municipalities where cartels had a direct interest in who held office. Winning an election in those places requires either cartel approval or extraordinary personal courage. Many of the people with the courage did not survive the campaign. In November 2024, Mexico's new government under President Claudia Sheinbaum launched Operation Enjambre, Operation Swarm, targeting the crime-politics connection at the municipal level. The first phase resulted in the arrest of 7 government functionaries in the state of Mexico, accused of collaborating with criminal organizations in murders, kidnappings, and extortion, and of facilitating criminal financing and governance. The operation later expanded to Oaxaca, Puebla, Tlaxcala, and Chiapas. In February 2025, the mayor of Tequila, Jalisco, the town famous for producing Mexico's most recognized export, was arrested along with 3 other local officials on charges of extorting businesses and collaborating with CJNG. In September 2025, the former Secretary of Public Security of Tabasco State was arrested and charged with leading a CJNG cell called La Barredora. He had served in that role under a man who had been a serious contender for the Mexican presidency. Mexico's justice system ranks 135th out of 143 countries assessed by the World Justice Project for public trust. Crimes go unreported because reporting them to the police means potentially reporting them to the cartel. Prosecutions are rare. Convictions are rarer. A 2015 report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found only 6 federal court convictions in Mexico for the crime of forced disappearance. In a country where at least 60,000 people had disappeared since 2006. Narcos showed corruption as the obstacle the heroes had to work around. In the real cartel wars, corruption is the environment everyone lives inside. And for the cartels, it is not an obstacle at all. It is infrastructure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The corruption that protects the cartels from above is one half of the story. The other half is what happens when that protection suddenly disappears. When a kingpin is killed, a cartel fractures, and the organization that was held together by one man's authority begins tearing itself apart. That story played out in real time in February 2026, when the Mexican army killed the most wanted man in the country, and the aftermath looked nothing like the end of Narcos. Section 9. El Mencho's death. The end of an era, the start of something worse. Narcos ends with Pablo Escobar dead on a rooftop in Medellin. Colombian police surround the body. The DEA agents who spent years hunting him stand in the aftermath. The music swells. The show treats the moment as a resolution, not a happy ending exactly, but a conclusion. The monster is gone. The war, at least this chapter of it, is over. That narrative logic, hunt the kingpin, kill the kingpin, close the chapter, is the spine of the entire Narcos franchise. It is also, as the real world has demonstrated repeatedly, completely wrong about how these organizations actually work. Nothing illustrated that more clearly than what happened in the mountains of Jalisco on February 22, 2026. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, had been the most wanted man in Mexico for years. The U.S. government had placed a $15 million bounty on his head. He had been indicted in multiple U.S. federal jurisdictions. The DEA considered him the leader of one of the two most dangerous drug trafficking organizations on Earth.
For more than a decade, he had evaded capture, moving constantly, trusting almost no one, maintaining security protocols that kept him invisible to the intelligence services of two countries trying to find him. What eventually led to him was not a breakthrough in signals intelligence or a tip from a rival cartel. It was surveillance of a trusted associate connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners. In the days before February 22nd, military intelligence tracked that associate's movements and confirmed that the partner had traveled to a residence inside the Tapalpa Country Club, an upscale, gated residential development in the mountain municipality of Tapalpa, Jalisco. The partner met with El Mencho at the property and departed on February 21st. The military moved the following morning. 6 helicopters provided air cover. Ground troops closed a cordon around the compound.
The operation had been coordinated with the United States Joint Interagency Task Force, Cartel, which had provided intelligence support during the planning phase. When the assault began, El Mencho's security detail opened fire with high-caliber weapons. 2 separate firefights broke out simultaneously, one at the compound itself and a second in the surrounding forest where El Mencho attempted to flee. During the aerial phase of the operation, a military helicopter providing support was struck by CJNG gunfire and forced to make an emergency landing. None of the soldiers on board were killed in that specific incident. El Mencho was killed during the operation. He was 59 years old. The Mexican government announced his death. And then the country started burning. Within hours of the announcement, CJNG executed a coordinated retaliatory response across multiple Mexican states simultaneously. The scale of what followed was not the reaction of an organization that had lost its leader. It was the reaction of a military force carrying out a pre-planned contingency operation. Cartel fighters erected 85 blockades on federal highways, stretching from Baja California in the north all the way to Oaxaca in the south, a geographic span covering the majority of the country. Criminal groups burned vehicles and carried out 27 separate attacks on security forces. 70 people were arrested in the immediate aftermath. In Jalisco alone, 25 members of the National Guard were killed in retaliatory attacks. A custodian and an official from the state prosecutor's office were also killed. A civilian woman lost her life. On the cartel side, 30 CJNG operatives were killed in Jalisco, with another 4 killed in neighboring Michoacan. The federal government deployed 2,500 additional Special Forces troops to Jalisco to reinforce the roughly 7,000 already stationed in the state. The civilian impact was immediate and total. Jalisco's governor issued a red alert, suspending public transportation and canceling large public events. Airlines including United, American, Delta, Alaska, and Air Canada canceled flights to both Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. The U.S. State Department issued shelter-in-place advisories for residents and travelers across multiple Mexican states. Schools closed. Government offices shut down in parts of Jalisco. Public transport across western Mexico ground to a halt. This was not a security operation with contained consequences. It was a nationwide disruption triggered by the death of one man. Proof that the organization he built had the capacity to paralyze significant portions of a country of 130 million people as a response to losing its founder. The violence spread beyond Jalisco. CJNG launched coordinated attacks across Colima, Michoacán, Nayarit, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, Aguascalientes, Zacatecas, and Sinaloa. In total, more than 250 roadblocks were reported across 20 to 22 Mexican states within the first 48 hours. It took the deployment of thousands of additional troops and the passage of roughly 2 days before the situation began to stabilize. What the aftermath demonstrated, to researchers, to military analysts, to the governments of both Mexico and the United States, was something that the Narcos narrative structure is fundamentally incapable of conveying. Killing the kingpin does not end the war. It changes it. The Medellin cartel fragmented after Escobar's death, and Colombian cocaine production continued without interruption. The Sinaloa cartel survived El Chapo's imprisonment and became, if anything, more decentralized and harder to dismantle as a result. CJNG, analysts warned immediately after El Mencho's death, faced the same trajectory: fragmentation into smaller, potentially more violent factions, competing for control of the territories and revenue streams he had unified under one command. El Mencho built his organization over 15 years into something that operated across 21 of Mexico's 32 states, maintained activity in more than 40 countries, and generated enough revenue that his personal fortune was estimated at up to $1 billion, with cartel assets valued as high as $50 billion. No single operation, however successful, dismantles that infrastructure. The people, the roots, the labs, the relationships, the money. All of it outlives the man at the top. Narcos told you the story ends when the kingpin dies. El Mencho's death proved, again, that it doesn't end. It just begins a new and often bloodier chapter. El Mencho's death, the Sinaloa Civil War, the drone program, the fentanyl crisis, the San Fernando massacres, all of it is real, documented, and ongoing. And yet, the version of the cartel wars that most people carry in their heads comes from a television show that its own creator described as half-fiction. The final question worth asking is not just what Narcos got wrong, but why the gap between the show and reality matters, and what the real story reveals about this conflict that no amount of prestige television has ever been willing to put on screen. Section 10. What Narcos got wrong. The glamour that never existed. Narcos is a good television show. That is worth saying plainly, because what follows is not an argument that the show was made badly or dishonestly. The production values were high. The performances were strong. The locations were real. The DEA agents whose experiences inspired the show, Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, served as consultants, bringing genuine knowledge of what it felt like to hunt Pablo Escobar through the streets of Medellin in the early 1990s. The show captured real events, real people, and real geography with more care than most dramatizations of historical events manage. And yet the showrunner himself, Eric Newman, told The Hollywood Reporter in 2016 that Narcos was 50-50 when it came to fiction and nonfiction. Half the show was invented, and the half that was invented did something to the audience's understanding of the cartel wars that no amount of accurate detail in the other half could fully correct. The core problem is not the inaccuracies in dates or names or the compression of timelines. Those are standard features of historical drama and mostly harmless. The deeper problem is what the show chose to dramatize and what it left entirely off the screen. Narcos is a story about powerful men, cat and mouse investigations, and the seductive danger of the criminal world. It has a visual language built around expensive cars, beautiful locations, and charismatic leaders who speak in memorable lines. It is, for all its violence, a glamorous show. The drug war it depicts is terrible but comprehensible. A conflict between organizations that operate with recognizable logic, pursue identifiable goals,
and whose leaders are complex human beings worth understanding. That framing is not false exactly, but it leaves out the 265 bus passengers stopped at fake military checkpoints in San Fernando and killed in mass graves. It leaves out the communities in coastal Michoacán that have been under explosive drone attack for years with no government intervention. It leaves out the 60,000 people who have disappeared in Mexico since 2006, most of whom have never been found, in a country where the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found only 6 federal convictions for the crime of forced disappearance in the years following. It leaves out the 5-year-old girl left alone on a street in Culiacán at night after her father was taken by a cartel faction during the Sinaloa Civil War. The show also simplified the political reality in ways that matter. It reduced the drug war to a binary: good law enforcement versus bad narcos, with corrupt officials as the obstacle in between. What it underplayed was the breadth of state involvement, the 71 years during which the ruling party and trafficking organizations operated in a structured arrangement that was not corruption in the conventional sense, but rather a system of co-governance. It did not fully convey that the cartels flourished not despite the Mexican state, but in many ways through it. When Peña and Murphy described their experiences in interviews after the show aired, they were careful to note that the show captured the emotional truth of the hunt, but that many of the specific scenes, conversations, and confrontations were written for television and did not happen as depicted. Private conversations between Escobar and politicians, tense one-on-one confrontations, the internal dynamics of cartel decision-making, all of it was scripted and speculative. One of the most significant things the show got wrong was the nature of what came after. Narcos treats the fall of each cartel as a story with a conclusion. Escobar dies, the Medellin cartel ends, the Cali cartel is dismantled. The show moves to Mexico and frames the Guadalajara cartel's collapse as the beginning of the Mexican chapter. Each season has a climax and a resolution. The actual history does not work that way. When the Medellin cartel collapsed after Escobar's death, the cocaine trade did not stop. It moved. Mexican cartels, which had been paid in cash for transporting Colombian product, shifted to a payment-in-kind arrangement in the late 1980s, taking portions of the shipments as payment instead of money, and used that product to build their own direct relationships with U.S. distribution networks. The dismantling of the Colombian cartels did not end the drug war. It transferred control of it to Mexico, where it became larger, more violent, and more deeply embedded in government structures than it had ever been in Colombia. The show's portrayal of the DEA agents themselves also took liberties that the real agents acknowledged. Steve Murphy and Javier Peña confirmed in interviews that they did break rules, policies, and procedures regularly during their time hunting Escobar. But they were clear that the show dramatized their involvement, elevated their personal agency in events that were more complex and collaborative, and placed them at the center of scenes and decisions that in reality involved dozens of people across multiple agencies and governments. Javier Peña was not involved in investigating the Cali cartel in the way the show depicted. His role was substantially altered to keep him as the lead character after the first 2 seasons. What Narcos ultimately gave its audience was a story about the drug war that was watchable, emotionally engaging, and culturally digestible.
It put a human face on organizations that are genuinely monstrous and made the conflict feel like something that could be understood, followed, and eventually resolved. That is what good television does. But the real cartel wars are not a story with seasons and finales. They are an ongoing, multi-generational conflict that has killed over 400,000 people in Mexico since 2006, displaced hundreds of thousands more, corrupted institutions at every level of government, introduced military-grade drone warfare into civilian neighborhoods, and delivered a synthetic drug so lethal that 2 milligrams, the weight of a few grains of salt, constitutes a fatal dose, through social media directly to teenagers in every U.S. state. The gap between what Narcos showed and what actually happened is not just a matter of dramatic license. It is the difference between a story about a war and the war itself. The show was compelling television. The reality it was based on has been, for the people living inside it, something that no amount of good cinematography and charismatic acting has ever come close to capturing. There is no season finale. There is no rooftop ending. The war is still going.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.